She did not scream. She did not cry. Charlotte Whitmore stood alone inside that carriage, still in her wedding gown, still holding white roses that would never reach the altar, and she read that letter one final time. I cannot marry you. My heart belongs to another. 7 years. Gone in 8 words. She folded the letter carefully, the way a woman folds her grief so no one can see how deeply it cuts. Then she whispered something nobody expected. He just made the greatest mistake of his life. Virginia summer, 1816. The Whitmore estate had never looked more beautiful, and Charlotte had never felt more certain that today, finally today, was the day everything she had worked for would be rewarded. She was 25 years old. The eldest daughter of Edmund Whitmore, one of Virginia's most respected landowners. She was not the kind of woman men wrote poems about. She was the kind of woman who kept the books, managed the harvest, organized the grain distribution before winter hit, and still had time to teach the youngest farmhand children how to read. People called her serious. People called her too responsible. People called her everything except what she truly was. She was extraordinary, and she had spent years pretending she did not know it. Because Nathaniel Ashford had told her early on that men did not like women who made them feel small. So she made herself smaller, and she waited. The morning of June 14th, 1816, Charlotte sat in the carriage beside her younger sister Eliza, who kept fussing with the buttons on Charlotte's gown. Hold still, Eliza said, laughing softly. You look stunning. He's going to see you walk through that door and forget every word of his vows. He better remember them, Charlotte said quietly with the ghost of a smile. I helped him write them. Eliza laughed again. Charlotte looked out the small window of the carriage. The road to St. Andrew's Church was lined with neighbors, townsfolk, friends of the Ashford family who had traveled from Richmond and Charlottesville and even further. Whitebans decorated the old oak trees. Children ran alongside carriages tossing wildflowers. Virginia had not seen a wedding like this in years, and Charlotte had not allowed herself to feel happiness like this ever. 7 years, she whispered almost to herself. Eliza reached over and squeezed her hand. He waited too. That means something. Charlotte nodded. But something behind her ribs, something small and old, shifted uncomfortably. The way a wound shifts when the weather changes. She pressed her hand flat against the bodice of her gown and breathed slowly. It means something, she told herself. It means everything. The carriage stopped, not at the church. They were still a quarter-mile away when the driver pulled the horses to a halt without warning, and Charlotte felt the sudden stillness like a weight dropped on her chest. Why are we stopping? Eliza asked, leaning toward the window. The door opened. It was not Thomas, their usual driver. It was a boy no older than 14, wearing the dark green livery of the Ashford household. His face was pale. His hands, as he held out the sealed envelope, were shaking so badly that the paper rattled. Miss Whitmore, he said, and his voice cracked on her name. Charlotte looked at the envelope for a full 3 seconds before she took it. She recognized the seal immediately. Nathaniel's seal. The Ashford family crest pressed in dark red wax. Who gave this to you? She asked, her voice completely calm. Mr. Ashford, ma'am, the boy said. He told me, he said. The boy swallowed hard. He said to give it only to you, and he said he was sorry. The word sorry dropped into the carriage like a stone into still water. Eliza made a sound. Charlotte broke the seal. The letter was brief. That was the first thing she registered. 7 years of her life, and the ending required less than 30 words. Charlotte. I cannot go through with the wedding. My heart has led me elsewhere. I pray you find it in yourself to forgive me. I have chosen Caroline Bellamy. She is to be my wife. N. Ashford. Somewhere far behind them, the church bells began to ring. The sound carried through the Virginia summer air, bright and golden, and completely unbothered by the fact that the world had just ended inside a carriage a quarter-mile away. Eliza made a sound that was not quite a word. Her hand flew to her mouth. Charlotte, she breathed. Charlotte, what does it say? Charlotte did not answer. She read the letter again. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases and held it in her lap. The bells kept ringing. The boy outside the carriage door had not moved. He was still standing there, hat pressed against his chest, looking at the ground as though he wished it would swallow him. "Thank you," Charlotte said to him, her voice steady as stone. "You may go." The boy fled. Eliza grabbed Charlotte's arm. "What does it say? Tell me right now. Charlotte?" "He chose someone else." Charlotte's voice did not shake. "He chose Caroline Bellamy." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Charlotte had ever heard. Then Eliza said in a voice made entirely of fury, "I will destroy him." "You will do no such thing," Charlotte said quietly. "He left you on your wedding day." "He left me a quarter-mile before the wedding." Charlotte almost smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "He did not even have the courage to do it at the altar. That tells you everything you need to know about Nathaniel Ashford." "Charlotte," Eliza's voice broke. "How are you so calm right now?" Charlotte looked down at the folded letter in her gloved hands. "Because," she said, "if I fall apart in this carriage, the only story anyone tells tomorrow is about the woman who wept. And I will not be that story." She looked up. "Drive us home, Thomas." But Thomas hesitated. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully from the driver's seat, "the guests, they are already at the church. Your father is there. Reverend Calloway is there. The Ashford family." "I know who is there," Charlotte said. "Drive us home." A pause. "Yes, ma'am." Her father was the one who came to her room that evening. Edmund Whitmore was not a man of many words. He had raised Charlotte on silence and example. He had taught her to ride before she could read. He had placed account ledgers in her hands at age 12 and told her, "If you can balance these, you can handle anything." He knocked once. "Come in," Charlotte said. She was sitting at her writing desk, still in her wedding gown. She had not been able to make herself remove it yet. Some part of her was still waiting for this to make sense. Edmund came in. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked across the room, pulled a chair close to her desk and sat down. "Your mother is in tears," he said. "Mama cries at sunsets," Charlotte replied. "She will survive." A beat. "How are you, Charlotte?" She looked at her father. For a moment, just a moment, the careful composure she had worn all day, like armor, almost came apart. She felt it, that shifting, cracking feeling behind her sternum. Then she breathed. "I am angry," she said. "And I will be angry for some time, but I am not broken." Edmund nodded slowly. "He was not worthy of you," he said. "He never was. I should have told you sooner." Charlotte looked at him. "You knew." "I suspected." He looked at his hands. "Nathaniel Ashford is a man who takes from people and calls it gratitude." "I saw it." "But you loved him, and I did not want to." "You should have told me." Her voice, for the first time all day, carried an edge. Edmund accepted it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I should have." The room was still. Outside, through the open window, the cicadas had begun their evening song. A Virginia night settling in, indifferent to heartbreak, warm and slow and steady. "What will people say?" Charlotte asked finally. Edmund straightened. "People will say what people always say, for a season. Then they will move on to the next thing." "They will call me damaged," Charlotte said flatly. "They will say I drove him away. They will find every reason to make this my fault." "Yes," Edmund said. "They will." Charlotte looked at him. "You are not going to argue that—" "Would it help if I did?" She considered. "No. Then I will not waste your time with pretty lies." Edmund leaned forward. "What I will tell you is this. You built Nathaniel Ashford's estate back from near ruin. You balanced his accounts, renegotiated his contracts, organized his tenant agreements, and saved 300 acres of Ashford land from foreclosure. You did all of that without a single person knowing your name." Charlotte said nothing. "That work," Edmund continued, "does not disappear because he does. You do not disappear because he does. Silence. Then Charlotte said softly, "He called me too serious, too practical. He said Caroline made him feel alive." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Some men do not want a woman who can think alongside them. They want an audience. I know that now." "Good." He stood. "Take the week. Grieve if you need to. Then come back to yourself." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "Charlotte." "Yes." "The accounts for the Hendricks farm are on my desk, when you are ready." She almost smiled. "Good night, Papa." She did not grieve for a week. She gave herself 2 days. On the third morning, she rose before sunrise, laced her own boots, walked down to the field where the early crops were already showing their first green, and she stood there in the pale summer light and let herself feel every single thing she had been holding back. She felt the humiliation. God, she felt it. The image of all those guests at St. Andrew's Church waiting. The sound of the bells. The expression on that 14-year-old boy's face as he handed her the letter like he was delivering a sentence. She felt the grief not for the wedding, she realized, not even truly for Nathaniel, but for the 7 years she had spent making herself smaller. For every time she had bitten back a sharp observation because she worried it would unsettle him. For every ledger she had fixed in secret so the credit would fall to him. For every morning she had woken up and asked herself, not, "What do I want?" but "What does he need from me today?" She stood in that field until the sun was fully up and the dew was burning off the grass. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she walked back inside. The gossip, as Edmund had predicted, was swift and merciless. "She was too cold," said Mrs. Patterson at the Thursday market. "A man needs warmth." "Too opinionated," said another. "She always had something to say." "Nathaniel chose well," murmured a third approvingly. "Caroline Bellamy is everything a wife should be. Charming, graceful, easy." Charlotte heard every word. She did not stop walking. She bought her flour and her salt and her candles, nodded politely to the shopkeeper, and drove the cart home herself, because she had given Thomas the morning off. But inside, every whispered word landed. Not because they destroyed her, because they clarified something. That the world had decided she was the problem. And the world would go right on deciding that unless she gave them a different story to tell. The Ashford wedding 3 weeks later was described by everyone who attended as perfectly lovely. Caroline Bellamy became Caroline Ashford on a Saturday afternoon in July. Charlotte was not invited. She did not expect to be. But Eliza came home from the market that Monday with a particular expression on her face, the expression she wore when she was furious on Charlotte's behalf and trying not to show it, and she sat down across from Charlotte at the kitchen table and folded her hands like she was about to deliver testimony. "He had the nerve," Eliza said carefully, "to tell Robert Hendricks that you understood the situation and bore him no ill will." Charlotte looked up from the inventory she was reviewing. "He said that. He implied you had wished him well privately." Charlotte set down her pen. "He implied," she said slowly, "that I had absolved him." "Yes." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. Then Charlotte picked up her pen again and made a note in the margin of the inventory. "Interesting," she said. "Charlotte, he took credit for my forgiveness the same way he took credit for everything else I did quietly." She did not look up. "That is very consistent of him." Eliza stared at her. "You are frightening sometimes, do you know that?" "Good," Charlotte said calmly. "People underestimate frightening women. It is very useful." That autumn, 3 things happened. First, the Hendricks farm went into a debt crisis that would have taken the family's land by Christmas without intervention. Charlotte restructured their contracts with the grain merchant on Market Street, negotiated a payment arrangement that gave them 18 months of breathing room, and organized a community work agreement among 6 neighboring families to share the harvest labor. She asked for nothing in return. She did not put her name on any paper. Second, a woman named Ruth Calloway, the Reverend's wife, a woman who had been notably cool to Charlotte since the broken engagement came to the Whitmore door one October morning and stood on the step with her hands folded and an expression that sat somewhere between gratitude and discomfort. "Mrs. Calloway," Charlotte said. "Miss Whitmore," the woman replied. "I owe you an apology." Charlotte waited. "I said things, after the summer, unkind things, about your character." She pressed her lips together. "I have since learned what you did for the Hendricks family, and I have since reconsidered my opinions." Charlotte studied her for a moment. "Would you like to come in for tea?" she asked. Mrs. Calloway looked surprised. Yes, thank you." "Good," Charlotte said, and stepped aside. "I would like to talk to you about the winter food distribution for the South Quarter families. I believe you have access to the church storage that I do not." Mrs. Calloway blinked. "You want to even after what I said?" "Mrs. Calloway," Charlotte said simply, "I am not interested in keeping score. I am interested in the South Quarter families getting through January 3rd. And this was the thing that would change everything, though. Charlotte did not know it yet. A businessman from Washington arrived in Charlottesville on the first cold day of November, asking quiet questions about a woman no one had thought to notice. His name was William Harrington. Charlotte did not meet him immediately. She heard his name first from her father, who had been invited to a dinner at the Maxwell estate, and came home with a particular thoughtfulness behind his eyes. "There is a man in town," Edmund said. "Harrington, from Washington." "I have heard the name," Charlotte said. She was mending a ledger binding at the time, reinforcing the spine with thin leather cord. "What does he want?" "He is looking at land," Edmund said. "Or so people believe." Charlotte glanced up. "But—" Her father paused. "He asked Maxwell about the Hendricks situation, specifically. He wanted to know who had structured the debt resolution." Charlotte set down the ledger. "Maxwell told him it was anonymous. And Harrington said he did not believe a debt resolution that precise was anonymous by accident." Edmund looked at his daughter. "He said it was the work of someone who understood land law, merchant contract structure, and community economics simultaneously. And he said he wanted to know who that person was." The room was quiet for a moment. "What did Maxwell say?" Charlotte asked. "Maxwell did not know the truth," Edmund said. "But I do." He paused. "I told him I would pass along his regards to the relevant party." Charlotte looked at her father for a long moment. "You did not tell him it was me." "I thought," Edmund said carefully, "that you should decide that for yourself." She decided, not immediately. But 3 days later, when William Harrington came to call at the Whitmore estate properly, with a card in the afternoon when visitors were received, Charlotte came downstairs in a dress the color of autumn leaves and met him in the front parlor with her hands ungloved and her accounting ledgers on the side table beside her in plain view, because she had decided that if this man had come looking for the person behind the Hendricks resolution, he was going to see exactly who that person was. William Harrington was 34. He was tall with the kind of stillness that suggested he was always thinking 3 steps ahead and had long since stopped feeling the need to fill silence unnecessarily. He was not the most handsome man Charlotte had ever seen. But he had the eyes of someone who listened, actually listened, and in her experience that was rarer than any physical feature. He stood when she entered. He did not reach for her hand to kiss it as was fashionable. He inclined his head. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Harrington," she replied. "Please sit." They sat. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens between two people who are both measuring something without wanting to be caught doing it. Then Harrington said without preamble, "I believe you saved the Hendricks family farm." Charlotte looked at him levelly. "What makes you believe that?" "Because I spent a week reviewing the restructuring, and it required 3 distinct areas of expertise that almost no one in this county possesses simultaneously." He held up a hand. "I am not asking for confirmation. I am telling you that I know." Charlotte said nothing. "I am also telling you," he continued, "that I have spent the last 3 years looking for someone with that precise combination of knowledge, integrity, and discretion, and I have not found them." He paused. "Until now." Charlotte folded her hands in her lap. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Harrington?" He looked at her directly. "I have significant landholding interests across 4 states. I have political work that requires substantial and discreet financial management. And I have been told by people I trust that you have demonstrated both the capacity and the character to handle work of considerable importance." "And you want to hire me?" Charlotte said. A beat. "I want to propose a partnership," he said. "Of a more formal kind." Charlotte studied him. "You are proposing marriage to a woman you have just met." "I am proposing," he said carefully, "to a woman I have spent 3 weeks learning about from everyone who knows her work, her record, and her character." He paused. "The meeting is the last step, not the first." Silence. "You investigated me," Charlotte said. "Thoroughly," he confirmed. He did not apologize for it. Charlotte felt something she had not felt in a very long time, sharp interest. Not the soft, hoping, waiting kind she had carried for Nathaniel. Something more like the feeling she got when a ledger finally balanced after a long and complicated reconciliation. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "I have been made very small by a man who wanted a woman he could overlook. I have no interest in repeating that experience." "I know," he said. "That is precisely why I am here." She held his gaze. "I am not looking for a position," she said flatly. "I am not looking for rescue. I am not grateful to be noticed." "Good," Harrington said. And something in his expression shifted just slightly into what Charlotte would later recognize as respect. "Because I do not need a woman to be grateful. I need a woman capable of standing alongside me without disappearing into my shadow." The room held its breath. Charlotte reached over to the side table. She picked up the top ledger and set it on the low table between them. "Then," she said, "let us have a real conversation." He came back the next day, and the day after that. They did not speak of marriage again for several weeks. They spoke of contract structures and land reform, and the grain supply crisis in the western counties, and the political landscape in Washington, and what Charlotte understood about community economics that most men with twice her resources had entirely failed to grasp. Harrington listened. He did not nod politely and change the subject. He took notes. Once in the second week, he said something that contradicted a point she had made, and she told him directly, without softening it, that he was wrong, and here was why. He stopped, read her reasoning, and said, "You are right, I stand corrected." Charlotte had been in rooms with educated men her entire life. She could count on one hand the number of times she had heard those 4 words. She began quietly to trust him. Not fully, not yet, but the thread was there. It was Eliza who said it first. Late November in Charlotte's room, the fire burning low, Eliza lying across the foot of the bed, watching Charlotte review correspondence with the particular focus she always brought to work. "You like him," Eliza said. "He is an intelligent man," Charlotte said, not looking up. Charlotte. "He has excellent analytical instincts and an unusual willingness to—" Charlotte. Charlotte looked up. Eliza was watching her with that expression, fond, exasperated, completely certain. "You like him," Eliza said again simply. A beat. "He has not given me reason not to," Charlotte said carefully. Eliza burst out laughing. Charlotte looked back down at her correspondence. But the corner of her mouth, just the corner, curved upward. On the last Sunday of November, Nathaniel Ashford and his new wife attended church. Charlotte was there. It was inevitable in a county this size. They had been successfully avoiding each other since the summer, with the mutual unspoken cooperation of people who understood that a direct confrontation would benefit neither of them. But there they were. Caroline Ashford was beautiful. Genuinely beautiful. Warm brown eyes, a laugh that carried across the churchyard, a way of resting her hand on Nathaniel's arm that made him stand 3 inches taller. Charlotte watched for approximately 10 seconds. Then she looked away. Not out of pain, out of completion. Like watching a book close that you had already finished and already understood the ending of. Nathaniel saw her. He went very still. Charlotte met his gaze. She did not smile. She did not look away first. She simply held it steady clear without any of the devastation he was perhaps expecting. And then William Harrington stepped up beside her and said quietly, "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," and offered his arm. And she took it. She felt Nathaniel's eyes on her back as they walked up the church steps. She did not look back. Later, much later, Eliza would ask her what she had felt in that moment. "Relief," Charlotte said. "Not anger. The anger was earlier. There is no room for anger anymore." She considered. "I felt relieved. Because I looked at him and I felt nothing of what I used to feel. And that meant I was free." "And Mr. Harrington being beside you?" Eliza asked with a carefully neutral expression. Charlotte looked at her sister. "That," she said, "felt entirely different." Winter came to Virginia, cold and fast that year. And Charlotte Whitmore, the woman society had spent 6 months quietly dismissing, was no longer paying attention to what society said about her. She had work to do. She had a man beside her who had looked at every part of her that the world called too much and called it exactly enough. And somewhere in Washington, a future was being built. Her name was already in it. She just did not know it yet. The morning after church, Charlotte woke before dawn with the particular clarity that only comes after something inside you finally settles. She had seen Nathaniel. She had felt nothing. And that nothing, that clean, hollow, finished nothing, was the most useful thing she had felt in months. She dressed in the dark, went downstairs, lit the kitchen lamp herself, and put water on for coffee before anyone else in the house had stirred. She sat at the kitchen table with Edmund's account ledgers spread before her, and she worked for 2 hours in the quiet of that early morning. And for the first time in a very long time, the numbers on the page were the only thing in her head. Not Nathaniel. Not the wedding that never happened. Not the whispers at market. Just the numbers. And the satisfaction of making them right. That was when she understood something her father had been trying to tell her for years without using the words directly. The work was not a consolation. The work was not what she did while she waited for her real life to begin. The work was her life. The rest had been the waiting. She was done waiting. When Edmund came downstairs an hour later and found her at the table, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment. "The Henderson grain contract," she said without looking up. "They have been undercharging for 3 seasons. At current market rates, they are losing approximately $40 per harvest. I have drafted a corrected agreement. You should review it before Thursday." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good morning, Charlotte." She looked up. Something in his expression, something careful and warm, made her throat tighten very briefly. "Good morning, Papa," she said, and went back to work. That was how December began. It was also the month William Harrington stopped coming to the Whitmore estate every other day and started coming every day. Not always for long. Sometimes just an hour to review a document or discuss a piece of correspondence he had received from Washington. But every day, without exception, the sound of hoofbeats on the front drive in the early afternoon became as regular as the mail. Charlotte did not comment on this. Eliza naturally commented on everything. "He came yesterday," Eliza said one morning, counting on her fingers, "and the day before, and the day before that, and I believe he is coming again this afternoon, which means this is no longer business visits." "Charlotte, this is work," Charlotte said firmly. "This is courtship," Eliza said with great satisfaction. "He has a significant land negotiation in Maryland that requires, Charlotte, he looked at you the other day when you were explaining the Henderson contract, and he looked like a man who had just found the thing he had been looking for his entire life, and could not quite believe his luck." Charlotte set down her pen. "That is a remarkable amount of detail to extract from a business meeting," she said. "I was watching from the hall," Eliza admitted completely without shame. Charlotte looked at her sister. Then she picked her pen back up. "Go away, Eliza." Eliza went away laughing. But Charlotte sat for a moment after her sister's footsteps faded down the hall, and she pressed the end of the pen against her lower lip, and she thought about the way William Harrington had looked at the Henderson contract, not at her, at the contract, and the way he had said quietly, This is the most elegantly structured renegotiation I have seen in 20 years of business, and the way that sentence had landed inside her chest differently than any compliment anyone had ever paid to her appearance, or her grace, or her composure. She breathed. Then she wrote the next line of figures and told herself to concentrate. She was almost successful. The first crisis came 3 days before Christmas. It arrived in the form of Harrington at the front door at 7 in the morning, which was not his hour, with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that Charlotte had not seen before. Not alarm exactly, something more controlled than that. Something that had been alarmed and then pulled itself back into discipline, the way a man pulls a horse back from a bad edge. Charlotte came downstairs, still pinning her hair, and took one look at his face. "What happened?" she said. He handed her the letter without preamble. It was from a man named Gerald Croft, a merchant in Richmond who held the primary grain supply contracts for 4 counties, including theirs. The letter informed Harrington that Croft had reached a new exclusive arrangement with a consortium of buyers in Philadelphia and would be terminating all current local agreements as of the 1st of January. Charlotte read it twice. Then she said, "If the local contracts are terminated, the South Quarter farms have no guaranteed buyer for the spring harvest." "Correct. They will default on their land payments by summer." "That is my calculation as well." "And Croft knows this." Harrington looked at her. "Croft knows this." Charlotte handed the letter back. "How much time do we have?" "The contracts terminate January 1st. It is December 22nd. 10 days. She was already thinking. "Sit down," she said. "I need paper." They worked for 4 hours at the kitchen table that morning. Edmund joined them at 9 and stayed until noon. Eliza brought coffee and then wisely disappeared. Charlotte mapped the supply chain backward from the Philadelphia buyers to Croft's warehouse operation, identified 3 points in the chain where the arrangement was legally vulnerable, and by early afternoon, she had a proposal drafted that would allow the local farms to form a collective agreement directly with 2 independent buyers. She had identified through Edmund's correspondence records, bypassing Croft entirely. It was not a perfect solution. It would require significant coordination and a level of trust between the farming families that did not currently exist on paper. But it was a solution. Harrington sat across from her and read through the proposal carefully. She watched him read it, the way his eyes moved, the way he paused on certain paragraphs, and went back, the way he did not rush through it to be polite, but actually read it. When he was finished, he set the papers down. I was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You built this in 4 hours." "The framework was already in my head," Charlotte said. "I have been watching the Croft arrangement for 2 seasons. It was not stable." Harrington looked at her. "You saw this coming." "I did not know the specific trigger, but yes." "And you did not say anything." Charlotte met his gaze. "I said something to my father, who said something to the Henderson family, who declined to pursue alternative arrangements because they had a long relationship with Croft and believed in loyalty to long-standing contracts." She paused. "I have learned that unsolicited analysis is rarely received well, so I wait until it is solicited." A silence. Then Harrington said very quietly, "I am soliciting it, now and going forward, unambiguously and without reservation. Do you understand me?" Something in his voice on those last 4 words, steady and direct and entirely serious, moved through the room like a current. Charlotte held his gaze. "I understand," she said. She did not look away first. Neither did he. And then Edmund walked back into the kitchen and asked if anyone wanted more coffee, and the moment broke, and Charlotte looked down at her papers, and the only evidence that anything had passed between them was the very slight additional speed at which she picked up her pen. The Croft crisis was resolved before Christmas. Charlotte presented the collective agreement proposal to 8 farming families over the course of 2 days, traveling with her father to each property, sitting in their front rooms, and explaining the arrangement in plain language, answering every question without condescension, and then, because she understood that trust was earned through specificity, presenting them with the names and written commitments of the 2 Philadelphia buyers she had already contacted through Edmund's network. She had not waited for the families to agree before contacting the buyers. She had known they would agree. Not out of arrogance. out of understanding exactly what people needed to hear before they said yes, and making sure those things were true. On Christmas Eve, all 8 families signed the collective agreement. Gerald Croft heard about it 2 days later and sent a furious letter to Edmund Whitmore demanding to know who had organized the arrangement and on what legal basis. Edmund wrote back one line: "The arrangement was organized by a private party and is entirely legal. Merry Christmas." He showed Charlotte the letter. She read it and laughed a real laugh, sudden and genuine, the kind she had not produced in months. Edmund looked pleased with himself. "You should laugh more," he said. "You have a good laugh." "I have a practical laugh," she said. "It comes out when things go right." "Then let us make more things go right," Edmund said. They shook hands over the kitchen table. It was the best Christmas Charlotte could remember. Harrington spent Christmas Day with the Maxwell family, as was his established custom. He sent a card to the Whitmore household that arrived the morning of the 25th, addressed in his characteristic direct handwriting, no flourishes, nothing decorative, just clean, deliberate letters, and inside was written only: "The agreement was excellent work. Happy Christmas." Eliza found Charlotte reading it at the kitchen table and said absolutely nothing, which was for Eliza the loudest possible response. Charlotte set the card on the table. "Not a word," she said. "I said nothing," Eliza said, pouring herself coffee with elaborate innocence. "You thought very loudly." "I have no idea what you mean." Charlotte folded the card and put it in her pocket. She did not take it out again until she was alone. The twist came in January, and it came from a direction Charlotte had not considered. She should have seen it coming. She would think later many times that she should have seen it coming, because the shape of it was entirely consistent with everything she already knew about people and power, and the way men protected arrangements that benefited them. But she had been focused elsewhere. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was addressed to William Harrington and delivered to the Whitmore estate, because that was where he spent most of his working afternoons. Charlotte was the one who took it from the postboy, and she recognized immediately that it was not ordinary correspondence, the weight of it, the seal, the quality of the paper. She set it on the side table in the parlor without opening it. When Harrington arrived at 2 o'clock, she handed it to him without comment. He read it standing in the parlor, coat still on, gloves in one hand. His expression did not change. That was how she knew it was serious, because William Harrington's face was readable to her now, in the way that ledgers were readable, and the careful flatness that settled over it. When he read that letter was the expression of a man absorbing a significant blow and deciding in real time how to carry it. He finished reading. He folded the letter. He looked at Charlotte. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else." Charlotte felt something in her chest tighten. Not fear exactly. Something more like the feeling before a storm, that atmospheric shift, that change in pressure. "Tell me," she said. He sat down. She sat down across from him. "There are men in Washington," he said, "who have decided that my political interests are becoming inconveniently aligned with reform positions that threaten certain financial arrangements." He paused. "They have decided the most effective way to undermine those interests is not to attack me directly. It is to attack my associations." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "They are going to come after the people connected to you." "They are going to come after you," he said. "Specifically." A silence. "Me," she said. "There is a faction, I will not name them yet, who have learned that you are the architect of the Croft resolution. They understand what that means in terms of your capability and your influence over local economic arrangements. They believe that if they can discredit you publicly, they can isolate me from the support base I have been building in this region." He held her gaze. "They are planning to release information about your broken engagement, with embellishments." Charlotte was very still. "What kind of embellishments?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, precise, like a blade. "The kind that suggests the engagement was broken due to conduct unbecoming." He said it directly without softening it, because he had learned in the weeks of working beside her that Charlotte Whitmore did not need protection from the truth. She needed the truth quickly and completely so she could respond to it effectively. Charlotte looked at her hands. The engagement. Nathaniel. 7 years folded into 8 words in a letter on her wedding day. And now those 8 words weaponized, reshaped into a story about her character rather than his choices. She breathed in slowly. "They are going to say I was abandoned for cause," she said. "Yes. And they intend to do this publicly, in print presumably. Richmond Gazette has been approached from what my correspondent can determine." Charlotte looked up. "How long do we have?" she said. Harrington looked at her with an expression she could not fully name, something between profound respect and something more personal than that. "That is the 3rd time in a month you have responded to a crisis by asking how long we have rather than what we should do about you." "I know what they are doing to me," Charlotte said steadily. "What I need to know is the timeline for an effective response." He held her gaze. 3 weeks, he said. "Perhaps 4. Then we have work to do." She stood up, walked to the side table, picked up a fresh sheet of paper. "I need a list of every person in Richmond who owes a favorable outcome to the Croft resolution," she said. "And I need it by Thursday." "Charlotte." She turned to look at him, and he stopped, because the expression on her face was not distress. It was not fear or grief or wounded pride. It was the expression of a woman who had been underestimated for the last time, and was now in the process of deciding exactly how to make that clear. "Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, "I have spent 7 years allowing a man to take credit for my work because I believed that was the cost of being loved. I have allowed society to decide my value based on whether a selfish man chose me. I am not doing that again." She looked at the blank paper in her hand. "If they want to make me the story, then I will write the story myself." Harrington was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. "Your connections in Washington, who control print access to the National Intelligencer," she said. "And your word that when this is over, you will stop calling me Miss Whitmore in professional contexts and start calling me Charlotte." A pause. Something moved across his face, quick and warm and carefully controlled. "You have both," he said. She turned back to the paper and began to write. He did not leave until dark. The counter-strategy. Charlotte built over the following 2 weeks was, in Edmund's words, the most precise piece of social engineering he had ever witnessed, and he said this with a mixture of paternal pride and slight alarm. It was not complicated. It was simply very well aimed. She contacted personally each of the 8 families who had signed the collective agreement. She told them plainly what was coming, not in a way designed to alarm them, but in the way she always communicated, which was directly and with complete respect for people's intelligence. She told them that powerful men in Richmond were planning to attack her character in order to disrupt a reform agenda that protected their interests. She told them she was not asking them to fight her battles. She was telling them so they could make informed decisions about whom they trusted. Every single family responded within 48 hours. The Henderson patriarch wrote a letter to the Richmond Gazette, praising by name the unnamed woman who had saved his family's land. He did not name Charlotte. She had asked him not to, not yet, but the description was specific enough to be unmistakable. Mrs. Ruth Calloway, the Reverend's wife, who had come to Charlotte's door in October, organized a letter signed by 14 women in the county, speaking to Charlotte Whitmore's character and community contributions. She presented it to Charlotte in her parlor one cold January afternoon with the expression of a woman paying a debt. "You did not have to do this," Charlotte said. "I did," Mrs. Calloway said simply. "I owed you a correction of the record." The third piece of the strategy was William Harrington. He wrote through his Washington connections a piece in the National Intelligencer describing the Croft Resolution as a landmark example of community economic cooperation without naming Charlotte, but with enough geographic and situational specificity that anyone in the relevant circles could trace it directly to her. He framed it as a model for regional economic reform. He called the architect of the arrangement a person of exceptional competence and public dedication. The Richmond Gazette printed its piece 2 weeks later. It was, as promised, an attempt to weaponize Charlotte's broken engagement. It described, in the careful language of innuendo, a young woman of uncertain character whose engagement had been terminated due to concerns about her suitability. It ran on a Wednesday. By Friday, Edmund Whitmore received a letter from the Gazette's editor saying that the paper had received an unprecedented volume of correspondence in response to the piece and would be printing corrections in the following week's edition. Charlotte read the editor's letter at the kitchen table on Friday morning. She set it down. She picked up her coffee. She drank it slowly, looking out the window at the January cold. Then she said to no one in particular, "That took 11 days. Eliza from across the table said, "You counted." "I estimated 12, Charlotte said. "I was optimistic." Eliza stared at her. Then she laughed so hard she had to put down her own cup. But the thing about Charlotte, the thing that would define everything that came after, was that she did not stop there. She did not declare victory and return to the quiet management of her father's estate and her careful, contained life. The attack had clarified something. She had spent years making herself useful in ways that were invisible. She had structured agreements and saved land and organized communities and kept her name off every piece of paper because she had genuinely believed that was the appropriate way for a woman of her position to exercise influence. She no longer believed that, not because she had decided to be reckless, because she had learned in the 11 days it took to dismantle the Richmond Gazette attack that invisibility was a choice, and it was not always a wise one, because invisible women could be made into whatever story powerful men decided to tell about them. Visible women could tell their own stories. It was Harrington who noticed the shift in her first. He came to the Whitmore estate on the Monday after the editor's letter arrived, and Charlotte was in her father's study. Not the kitchen table, not the parlor, but the actual study, with Edmund's chair pushed aside and her own work spread across the desk, and she was writing correspondence under her own name. He stood in the doorway and looked at the papers. "You signed them," he said. "I signed them," she confirmed without looking up. A pause. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up at the name. It was the first time he had used it as promised, and something in the casual naturalness of it, the way it simply fit, made her stop for a half-second. "What?" He looked at her steadily. "I would like to speak to your father." Charlotte looked at him. She understood what he meant. "You told me," she said carefully, "that you had spent 3 weeks learning about me before you came to this house. You told me the meeting was the last step." "Yes, and now it has been 6 weeks of actual work together, of crisis management and correspondence and 4-hour kitchen table strategy sessions." She set down her pen. "What are you waiting for?" A pause. Something shifted in his face. That careful control he wore like a second coat moving just slightly. "I was waiting," he said, "to be sure you were choosing a future, not escaping a past." The room was very quiet. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "Those are not mutually exclusive," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "But one is a better foundation than the other." She considered this. "And what is your conclusion?" she asked. He held her gaze. "That you have been choosing a future since the morning you went back to the ledgers, possibly before." He paused. "I would like your father's answer, and then I would like yours." Charlotte looked down at the correspondence on the desk. Her name at the bottom of each letter clear and deliberate. The letters themselves addressed to buyers and landowners and community organizers across 4 counties, because the Croft resolution had shown her what was possible when people had adequate information and someone willing to coordinate it. She looked back up. "Speak to my father," she said. "He is in the garden." Harrington nodded. He turned to leave. "Mr. Harrington," Charlotte said. He turned back. She met his eyes. "The answer," she said quietly, "will be yes." His expression did not break into a smile. That was not his way. But something behind his eyes, something that had been very careful and very controlled for a very long time, settled. The way a question settles when it finally finds its answer. He inclined his head and walked out toward the garden. Charlotte picked up her pen. She looked at the blank line at the bottom of the next letter where her signature would go. She wrote it clearly, firmly, without hesitation. Charlotte Whitmore. Outside through the window, she could not see from her chair her father and the man she was going to marry were having a conversation in the January garden. Inside, the woman who had spent 7 years learning to be invisible was letter by letter making herself impossible to overlook. The wedding announcement ran in the National Intelligencer the following week, not the Richmond Gazette. Charlotte had chosen the paper deliberately. Edmund asked her about it over breakfast the morning it was printed. He held the paper and looked at the announcement. Plain, direct, her name, and Harrington's the date, the location, and he said, "You are making a statement." "I am stating a fact," Charlotte said. "The paper determines who hears it." Edmund nodded slowly. "And the Richmond Gazette?" Charlotte spread butter on her bread with complete calm. "Let them print their corrections," she said. "Then let them print the announcement as a follow-up story. Let their readership draw their own conclusions about a woman of uncertain character who just announced her engagement to Washington's most prominent reformist businessman." Edmund looked at his daughter. Then he set down the National Intelligencer and picked up his coffee cup. "I should have given you the business accounts at age 10, he said. Charlotte bit into her bread. "Probably," she agreed. Across town, in the large, comfortable house that Nathaniel Ashford had purchased for his beautiful new wife, Caroline, read the announcement aloud over breakfast. And Nathaniel, who had spent the last 6 months telling himself he had made the right choice, sat very still with his coffee going cold in his hand. He had known about Harrington. People talked. He had heard the visits, the morning strategy sessions, the way Charlotte's name had begun to appear in conversations about the Croft resolution and the Henderson arrangement and the collective agreement. He had told himself it was business. He had told himself it was not his concern. But seeing the announcement in print, Charlotte Whitmore and William Harrington, made something very cold and very sharp settle behind his ribs. Not because he loved her. He had convinced himself long ago that what he had felt for Charlotte was respect rather than love, and that respect was not enough. But because he understood reading that announcement that he had spent 7 years beside the most capable person he had ever known, and he had called her too serious. "Nathaniel," Caroline said from across the table. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he said. He folded the paper. He was not fine. He would not be fined about this for a very long time. And Charlotte, who did not know about Nathaniel's morning or his cold coffee, or the sharp thing settling behind his ribs, was already at her desk, writing the next letter signed with her name, addressed to the future that she had decided clearly and without apology to build. The engagement announcement changed everything and nothing at once. Charlotte had expected the social landscape to shift. She had calculated it the way she calculated everything. Assessed the variables, mapped the likely responses, prepared for the range of outcomes. What she had not calculated, because there was no ledger column for, it was how it would feel to walk into the Thursday market the week after the announcement and watch the way people looked at her differently. Not all of them. Some of the whispers simply changed direction without changing their nature. Mrs. Patterson, who had spent 6 months murmuring about Charlotte's coldness and lack of charm, now murmured instead about the speed of the engagement and what that suggested about Mr. Harrington's judgment. People like Mrs. Patterson were not interested in the truth of Charlotte Whitmore. They were interested in having an opinion about her. Charlotte had long since made her peace with that. But others, the Henderson family, the Calloway household, the 6 farming families who had signed the collective agreement, those people looked at her differently. Not with the pity that had followed her since June. With something Charlotte recognized after a moment as respect. It was an unfamiliar sensation. Not unwelcome. She was buying salt at the main counter when James Henderson, the patriarch who had written the letter to the Gazette, appeared beside her and removed his hat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "congratulations on your engagement." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." He turned the hat in his hands. A big man, weathered and deliberate, not given to unnecessary speech. "I want you to know," he said, "that letter I wrote, I meant every word of it. Your father raised you right." Charlotte looked at him. "You saved your own land, Mr. Henderson. I simply showed you how the numbers worked." He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. You came to my house in December in the cold, and sat with my wife and my 3 boys, and explained it plain enough that we understood it. That's not nothing. That's something." He put his hat back on. "Harrington's a lucky man." He walked away before she could answer. Charlotte stood at the counter with her salt and her receipt, and felt something shift quietly in her chest. Not pride exactly. Something more grounded than that. The feeling of a thing being correctly named after a long time of being mislabeled. She drove herself home and sat with it for the length of the journey without trying to turn it into anything useful. Sometimes a feeling was just a feeling. She was learning that. The first real test of what the engagement meant in practical terms came not from society, but from Washington, and it came faster than either Charlotte or Harrington had anticipated. He arrived on a Thursday morning a full hour earlier than his usual afternoon visit, and the expression on his face when Charlotte came downstairs was the same controlled alarm she had seen the morning of the Croft letter. Except this time, there was something else underneath it. Something that looked on William Harrington's carefully composed face remarkably like anger. He waited until they were in the study, with the door closed before he spoke. "Senator Graves has made an announcement," he said. "He is backing a candidate for the Virginia Assembly seat that I had intended to run for in the spring." Charlotte looked at him. "Who is the candidate?" "Thomas Bellamy." The name landed in the room like a stone. Charlotte was very still for 3 full seconds. Thomas Bellamy was Caroline Ashford's brother, which meant Nathaniel Ashford's brother-in-law, which meant that the faction in Washington opposed to Harrington's reform agenda had found with considerable efficiency a way to make the political personal. "That is not a coincidence," Charlotte said. "No," Harrington said. "It is not. They chose Bellamy specifically because of the connection to Ashford, because of the connection to me." She looked at the desk. "They are trying to make your candidacy about your fiancé's past rather than your platform." "Yes." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does your platform require that theirs does not?" Harrington looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean specifically. What does your reform agenda do that Graves and Bellamy would lose money preventing?" he told her. She listened, the way she always listened, completely still. No interruptions. The information going into that precise, organized mind of hers, and being sorted and filed while he was still speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. "The grain supply legislation," she said, writing as she spoke. "If that passes, it breaks the Philadelphia Consortium's monopoly on regional pricing. That is the same consortium that Croft was dealing with, which means the people funding Bellamy's candidacy are almost certainly connected to the same financial interests that tried to destroy the collective agreement in December." Harrington went very still. "Say that again," he said. Charlotte looked up. "I believe the opposition to your candidacy and the attack on the local farming collective are connected. The same money, possibly the same directive." She set down her pen. "Which means we are not dealing with a political rival. We are dealing with an organized financial interest that is threatened by both your legislation and by the precedent set here in January." The silence that followed had weight to it. Then Harrington said, "Can you prove it?" "Not yet," Charlotte said. "But I know how to find out." He looked at her steadily. "This is going to get considerably more complicated." "Most important things do," she said, and picked up her pen again. "The investigation, because that was what it became, though. Charlotte would never have called it that. At the time took 3 weeks and required a level of discretion that Charlotte had spent years developing without knowing she would ever need it for something this specific. She wrote letters. A great many letters under her own name, as she had been doing since January. But also through her father's older network of contacts, men who had known Edmund Whitmore since before Charlotte was born, who trusted his name, and by extension, trusted anyone he vouched for. She traced the financial connections between Gerald Croft's Philadelphia arrangement and the backers of Thomas Bellamy's Assembly campaign. She did it carefully, methodically, without telling anyone except Harrington and Edmund what she was doing, because she understood that the value of the information depended entirely on when it was revealed and by whom. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in February, from a direction she had not expected. It was Nathaniel Ashford who provided it, not intentionally. He had no idea what he was doing. It happened at a public meeting, a community forum about the spring planting season that Charlotte attended with her father, which the Ashfords also attended because their land holdings made them relevant to any regional agricultural discussion. Charlotte had known they might be there. She had been prepared to be professionally civil and nothing more. What she had not been prepared for was Nathaniel finding a moment to speak to her privately at the edge of the room while Edmund was in conversation across the hall. He looked, she thought, like a man who had rehearsed something and was no longer confident it was worth saying. "Charlotte," he said. She turned, looked at him directly, waited. He pressed his lips together. "I wanted to say Caroline's brother is running for the assembly." "I am aware," Charlotte said. "I want you to know I had no part in it. The Senate backing the timing that was Graves and his people. Thomas is—" He stopped. "He is ambitious. He saw an opportunity and took it. I could not have stopped it if I had tried." Charlotte studied him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because." He looked down at his hat, which he was holding in front of him, the way the messenger boy had held his months ago outside the carriage. "Because I know what they are doing. I know they are using Thomas to damage Harrington's campaign. And I know why they chose him." He looked up. "I know it is because of the connection to me, to what happened last summer." Charlotte was quiet. "I made a mistake," Nathaniel said. Not smoothly, not gracefully. The words came out rough and halting, like something that had been stuck for a long time. "I made a significant mistake, and I know that nothing I say changes that. But I want you to know that I did not intend for my choices to be used against you again." The room moved and murmured around them. No one was listening. To any observer, they were two people having a brief, polite exchange at a community meeting. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm, honest. "I believe you did not intend it." He looked slightly relieved. "However," she said, and his expression recalibrated, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer." He straightened. "All right." "Thomas Bellamy's campaign is funded through intermediaries. Do you know who the primary backer is?" A pause. "Charlotte." "Nathaniel." She held his gaze. "I am not asking you to betray your family. I am asking you whether you know information that would allow me to protect several hundred farming families from the same financial interests that tried to destroy their collective agreement in January." She paused. "You said you wanted to make this right." The silence stretched. Nathaniel looked at the hat in his hands. Then he looked up. He said one name, and Charlotte, who had been building a map in her mind for 3 weeks, felt every piece of it click into alignment. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. "Charlotte." He stopped, started again. "I hope you know I see it now, what I—" He shook his head. "I see it now." Charlotte looked at him for one long moment. "I know," she said quietly. "I think you always saw it. I think you were frightened of it." She turned and walked back across the room to her father. She did not look back, but she was not cold about it. She was not cruel. She simply understood, had understood for months now, that Nathaniel Ashford was not a villain. He was a man who had chosen comfort over courage and who would spend a long time understanding the cost of that choice. She did not need to add to that cost. She did not need anything from him anymore at all. What she needed was on the paper she was composing in her head before she reached her father's side. That evening she told Harrington everything, not just the name, the entire web she had traced over 3 weeks, the Philadelphia Consortium, the connection to Croft, the intermediary funding structure for Bellamy's campaign, the legislative pressure points that made the reform agenda a financial threat to certain very powerful men. Harrington sat across from her at the study desk and listened with an intensity that Charlotte had come to recognize as his highest level of attention. He did not interrupt. He did not reach for paper to take notes. He held everything she said in his head, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "This is enough." "It is enough to expose them," Charlotte said. "Whether it is enough to win depends on timing and on who carries the information and how. You have thought about the how." "I have thought about the how." She laid it out. It was in its way as elegant as the Croft resolution. Not complicated. Surgical. 3 moves in the right sequence through the right channels, and the financial support behind Bellamy's campaign would not collapse because men like that did not simply collapse, but would be sufficiently exposed that the political cost of continuing to back him would outweigh the financial benefit. When she finished, Harrington looked at her for a long moment. "You built this," he said, "while also managing the Henderson Spring contract renewal, supporting your father's estate accounts, corresponding with 4 county agricultural organizers, and planning a wedding." "The wedding planning is mostly Eliza," Charlotte said. He almost smiled. That particular almost smile she had catalogued over the past months, the one that reached his eyes even when it did not complete itself on his face. "Charlotte," he said. She looked at him. "When we are married," he said carefully, "I want you to understand something. The work you do, the analysis, the strategy, the network you have built, I do not intend to put my name on it." She looked at him steadily. "That is a very specific thing to say." "It is a very specific promise," he said. "Your name will be on your work, where it belongs." The room was quiet. "Nathaniel Ashford used to tell me," Charlotte said slowly, "that I was too serious, that I thought too much, that men did not like women who made them feel—" She stopped. "Small," Harrington said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "I have never once felt small beside you. I have felt challenged, outpaced occasionally, better than I was the day before." He paused. "That is not the same thing." Charlotte looked at him. For a moment, just one, she let herself feel all of it. The 7 years, the letter, the carriage, the bells, the folded grief. The autumn she had spent making herself useful in every way that did not require being seen. The December crisis and the January letters, and the careful, precise, exhausting work of building a reputation out of facts when someone had tried to build a lie out of her history. All of it had led here. To this desk, this man, this moment. She breathed. "The first move needs to happen by Friday," she said. He nodded. "I will contact Washington in the morning." "The second move should come from the Henderson community directly, not from us. It needs to look independent." "Agreed." "And the third—" She stopped. He waited. "The third move," she said, "should come from me, directly and publicly, under my name." A beat. "Are you certain?" he asked. Not protectively, not out of doubt in her, out of understanding that this was a threshold, and thresholds mattered. "I have been certain," Charlotte said, "since February." He nodded. "Then that is how we do it." The 3 moves happened in the sequence Charlotte had designed over 11 days in late February. The first was a letter drafted by Harrington and sent through his Washington connections, requesting a formal review of the campaign funding sources for all Virginia Assembly candidates. It was procedural, carefully worded, and gave no indication of specific targets. It simply created a mechanism. The second came from James Henderson, who organized a public statement signed by 23 farming families in the county, detailing the economic effects of the Philadelphia Consortium's pricing arrangements on local agriculture, and specifically naming the intermediary contracts that connected that consortium to regional political interests. Henderson's name was first on the list. He had signed without hesitation. "You asked me once to put my name on something that mattered," he told Charlotte when she came to collect the document. "I reckon this is it." She had not in fact asked him that, but she understood that in his memory that was what the kitchen table meetings had meant. "Yes," she said. "This is it." The third move ran in the National Intelligencer on a Friday morning in late February. It was not long. Charlotte had written it in an hour and revised it for 2 days, which was her usual ratio. It was an essay, not a letter, not a statement about the relationship between regional economic policy and local farming communities. It named specific financial arrangements. It named specific legislative positions and their financial backers. It named with documented evidence the connection between the consortium's interests and the current effort to place a candidate in the Virginia Assembly, whose stated platform directly contradicted the needs of the farming communities he claimed to represent. At the bottom, it was signed Charlotte Whitmore, Whitmore Estate, Virginia. Edmund read it over breakfast and set it down and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "Your mother is going to have a great deal of feelings about this." Mama has a great deal of feelings about most things, Charlotte said. She will also be very proud. Charlotte looked up. Edmund was looking at her with an expression she could not remember seeing on his face before, or perhaps she had seen it all her life, and only now had the right frame for it. I am very proud, he said simply. Charlotte looked back at her coffee. Thank you, Papa, she said quietly. The response to the essay was not immediate. That was the nature of political consequences. They moved slowly at first, and then all at once. For the first 3 days, there was silence from the Washington faction. Charlotte interpreted this correctly as the silence of people deciding how to respond, which was different from the silence of people who had no response. On the 4th day, a rebuttal appeared in the Richmond Gazette. It was poorly argued and relied heavily on questioning the appropriateness of a woman publishing political analysis under her own name. It did not dispute a single specific fact in Charlotte's essay. Charlotte read it over breakfast and said, "They did not address the evidence." "No," Harrington said from across the table. He had taken to having breakfast at the Whitmore house on days when there was active work to be discussed, and somehow the arrangement had become normal with the quiet efficiency of most things that were simply right. A rebuttal that does not address the evidence, Charlotte said, is a concession that reads as an attack. Which makes the attacker look desperate, she finished. Yes. She set down the Gazette. When does Graves make his public statement? His office sent word this morning, Monday. Then we wait until Monday. She picked up her coffee. Charlotte, Harrington said. She looked at him. When did you become entirely unafraid? He asked. Not rhetorically. With genuine curiosity, the way he asked everything directly, because he actually wanted to know. She considered the question seriously. I do not think I am unafraid, she said. I think I decided that being afraid was not a sufficient reason to stop. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to tell you something. She waited. Before I came to Virginia, he said, before I found the Hendricks resolution and started asking questions, I had been looking for a particular kind of person for a very long time. Someone who could think clearly under pressure. Who understood that influence is built from the ground up, not handed down. Who had the kind of integrity that does not negotiate with convenience. He paused. I had looked in Washington. I had looked in Philadelphia. In Boston. Another pause. I had not thought to look in a Virginia county in the aftermath of a broken engagement, which was in retrospect a significant failure of imagination on my part. Charlotte looked at him. Is that an apology for taking so long? She asked. It is a statement of fact, he said, with mild self-criticism attached. The corner of her mouth moved. Accepted, she said. Senator Graves made his public statement on Monday morning. It was, as Charlotte had anticipated, a careful political retreat, disguised as a principled position change. It mentioned new information that required further review. It suggested that the Assembly candidacy required additional consideration. It did not mention Charlotte Whitmore or her essay. It was in all the ways that mattered a defeat. By Tuesday, 2 of the consortium's intermediary backers had quietly withdrawn their support from Bellamy's campaign. By Thursday, Thomas Bellamy himself issued a statement declining the candidacy due to personal reasons. Charlotte read the statement without comment. Harrington, sitting across the desk, said, You knew this would happen. I calculated it was the most probable outcome, Charlotte said. There is a difference. Not a large one in this case. No, she agreed. Not a large one. She looked out the window, winter finally releasing its grip on Virginia, the first warmth of early spring, beginning the light changing. She had a sudden and vivid memory of June. The wedding morning, the white roses, the bells, the letter in 8 words. The distance between that morning and this one was not measured in months. It was measured in everything she had done since she folded that letter and put it away. William, she said. He looked up at the sound of his name. She used it rarely, still and deliberately, which meant when she did, he paid complete attention. Yes. The Assembly seat, she said. When do you file? End of March. She nodded. I will have the regional economic platform documented and ready for public distribution by the 20th. He looked at her steadily. Under both our names. She started to say something. Stopped. Under both our names, he repeated. Not as a concession, as a statement of fact, the way he stated most things directly without decoration, because he meant exactly what he said, and nothing more or less. Charlotte looked at the desk. At her letters, signed with her name. At the account ledgers balanced and clear. At the window and the light beyond it changing. All right, she said quietly. Both our names. Outside, spring was beginning, and Charlotte Whitmore, who had spent 7 years building everything quietly for someone who could not see her value, and 6 months rebuilding herself into someone who no longer required anyone else's vision to know her own worth, was writing the next chapter. Under her own name. Alongside a man who had never once asked her to be smaller. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and the world, which had spent the better part of a year deciding what kind of woman Charlotte Whitmore was about to discover that it had badly underestimated her from the beginning. The wedding was set for the 15th of March. Charlotte had not wanted a large ceremony. She had said so clearly once to her mother, who had received the information with the expression of a woman being told the sky was green and choosing to simply wait for it to correct itself. Every woman wants a proper wedding, Margaret Whitmore said. I had a proper wedding prepared once, Charlotte said. I would prefer something different this time. Her mother went quiet in the particular way she went quiet when Charlotte said something that she could not argue with and did not want to agree with. Then she said, "At least let me have the house done properly." Charlotte had agreed to that. It seemed a fair trade. But in the 3 weeks between Thomas Bellamy's withdrawal and the wedding date, something happened that Charlotte had not calculated for. Something that arrived not from Washington or Richmond or any of the political and financial landscapes she had been navigating for months, but from inside herself. She was afraid, not of Harrington, not of the marriage, not of the future she had spent the last 6 months building toward with the same precise determination she brought to every ledger and every letter and every crisis that landed on her desk. She was afraid, she realized on a Thursday night when she could not sleep, that she was still the woman who had made herself small. That the Charlotte who had spent 7 years shrinking herself to fit beside Nathaniel Ashford had not actually been replaced by the woman who signed her name to political essays in the National Intelligencer. That the second Charlotte was a performance carefully constructed, and the first one, the one who waited and hoped and made herself convenient, was still underneath waiting. She lay in the dark and thought about this for a long time. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and wrote it down. Not a letter, not a strategy, just the truth of it in plain words on a single sheet of paper. What she was afraid of. Why? What it would mean if she was right. What it would mean if she was wrong. She read it back when she was finished. Then she folded it, walked to the kitchen fireplace, and burned it, because writing it had been enough. She did not need to keep it. She needed to know it was real, and then she needed to know what to do with it. She went back to bed and slept until sunrise. In the morning she came downstairs and found Harrington already at the kitchen table with Edmund, which was unusual. He rarely arrived before 10, and both men had an expression that sat somewhere between careful and concerned. Charlotte stopped in the doorway. "What happened?" she said. Harrington looked at her. "Senator Graves issued a new statement this morning." She crossed to the table and took the paper he held out. Graves had not given up. She had calculated that he might not, but she had assessed the probability as low after Bellamy's withdrawal. She now understood, underestimated the man's anger. The statement did not attack the Bellamy candidacy or the financial exposure of the consortium. It attacked William Harrington, directly calling into question his fitness for the assembly seat, based on what Graves termed the undue influence of personal associations in matters of public policy. It was careful language, precise enough to be meaningful, vague enough to deny specific accusation. But the implication was clear. The personal association was Charlotte. The argument was that a man who allowed his fiancée to conduct political analysis and publish it under their combined names was either not in control of his own affairs or was deliberately using a woman as a shield to make aggressive political moves while maintaining personal deniability. Charlotte set the paper down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He is attacking your judgment by attacking my role." "Yes," Harrington said. "If you distance yourself from the essay, if you say it was mine alone, and you had limited involvement, you protect the candidacy, but you undermine the partnership." "Yes." "And if you stand by it, Graves continues the attack, and the story becomes about your fiancé rather than your platform." That is approximately the situation. Edmund said nothing. He was watching Charlotte. She picked up the paper again, read the key paragraph once more, set it down. "He made a mistake," she said. Both men looked at her. "He is assuming," she said, "that being associated with me is the vulnerability. He is building his attack on the premise that a man being influenced by a woman is inherently discrediting." She looked at Harrington. "Which means his argument only works if the audience agrees with that premise." Harrington was very still. "And if the audience does not agree," Charlotte continued, "then the attack does not land. It simply reveals that Graves believes women's contributions are inherently suspicious, which is its own statement about his politics." She paused. "The farming families who signed Henderson's letter, the 14 women who signed Mrs. Calloway's letter, the readers of the National Intelligencer who responded to the essay." She met Harrington's eyes. "Are those people likely to find it discrediting that you worked with me?" A long silence. Harrington looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. "No," he said, "they are not." "Then we do not defend the arrangement," Charlotte said. "We make it a feature." Edmund exhaled slowly. "Charlotte," he said, "sometimes I forget how good you are at this." "I have been practicing," she said, and pulled the paper toward her to start drafting the response. The response ran, 48 hours later again in the National Intelligencer, this time under Harrington's name alone. Charlotte's choice, not his, because she understood that a man defending a woman's participation was a different and more powerful statement than a woman defending her own. And it said in the kind of language that was plain enough to be quoted in any parlor in Virginia, "My fiancée, Miss Charlotte Whitmore, has contributed to my political and economic work with intelligence, integrity, and a depth of knowledge that I would be a fool to ignore. I do not consider this a vulnerability. I consider it an extraordinary advantage. Any man who believes that the competence of the woman beside him diminishes his own has fundamentally misunderstood what strength looks like." Eliza read it aloud at the breakfast table. When she finished, she set the paper down very carefully. Then she said, "I would like someone to say that about me someday." Charlotte looked at her sister. "You should not settle for less." "I absolutely will not," Eliza said firmly, and poured herself more coffee with the decisive energy of a woman making a personal resolution. The response to Harrington's statement was swift, and to some people's surprise, overwhelmingly positive. Not universally, nothing in political life was universal, but the tenor was clear. The farming families responded through Henderson. Mrs. Calloway organized a second letter. Several prominent businessmen in Charlottesville, who had benefited from the Croft resolution without knowing Charlotte's name, now had her name and used it in their own correspondence about Harrington's candidacy. Graves went quiet. The quiet lasted 4 days. What broke it was not another statement from Graves. It was a private letter delivered to the Whitmore estate on a Sunday afternoon addressed to Charlotte personally, in handwriting she did not recognize. She opened it. It was from Caroline Ashford. Charlotte read it twice before she was entirely certain she understood what she was reading. Caroline Ashford, Nathaniel's wife, Thomas Bellamy's sister, the woman who had been cast as Charlotte's replacement and rival in every social narrative since last June, had written to Charlotte to apologize. Not a political apology, not a strategic one. The letter was 3 paragraphs handwritten, and it was the most genuinely human thing Charlotte had read in a year. Caroline wrote that she had not known when she and Nathaniel had become involved the full circumstances of his prior engagement. She wrote that she had since learned considerably more from Nathaniel himself and from the events of the past months. She wrote that she had no part in her brother's candidacy or the attacks on Charlotte's character, and that she was deeply sorry for the pain caused by her brother's actions specifically, and by the situation generally. She ended with, "I am not writing to ask for anything. I only wanted you to know that I see what has been done, and I do not believe any of it was fair to you." Charlotte sat with that letter for a long time. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She wrote back. Not a long letter. 3 paragraphs matching Caroline's length. She was not yet ready for more than that, and she believed in honesty over performance. She thanked Caroline for writing. She said that she bore her no ill will, and she said with the directness that was simply her nature, that if their paths crossed socially, she hoped they could manage it with grace, because the county was not large enough to carry unnecessary hostility between households. She sealed it and gave it to Thomas to deliver. Then she went to find Eliza. "I just wrote to Caroline Ashford," she said. Eliza looked up from her embroidery with an expression of controlled shock. "You did what?" "She wrote to me first," Charlotte said, "to apologize for her brother." "And you?" Eliza set down the embroidery. "Charlotte, do you ever do the expected thing?" "Occasionally," Charlotte said, by accident. Eliza stared at her for a moment. Then she said, "What did you say to her?" "That I bear her no ill will, and that I hope we can be civil." "You—" Eliza pressed her hand over her mouth briefly. "Do you know what people will say when this gets out? Because it will get out. It always gets out. They will say I am either a saint or a fool," Charlotte said calmly. "Neither of which is accurate. I am a practical woman. Caroline Ashford has no quarrel with me. I have no quarrel with her. And the less energy I direct toward the Ashford household, the more I have for the work that actually matters." Eliza looked at her sister for a long moment. "Sometimes," she said finally, "you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met." "I am your only sister," Charlotte said. "Your sample size is limited." "Charlotte, go back to your embroidery, Eliza." Eliza went back to her embroidery, shaking her head slowly with the expression of a woman who had given up trying to predict what Charlotte would do next, and had decided to simply admire it after the fact. The wedding day arrived on a Thursday morning that was warm for March, the kind of spring morning that felt like an apology from the winter, gentle and clear and unhurried. Charlotte dressed in her own room with Eliza and her mother, and this time when Eliza fussed with the buttons, Charlotte let her. She stood still and let her sister's hands work, and her mother's voice fill the room with the particular blend of instruction and sentiment that Margaret Whitmore had always used when she could not quite say the thing she meant directly. "The dress is beautiful," her mother said. "Thank you, Mama. Harrington is a good man. I know. He looks at you the way a man should look at a woman he intends to spend his life beside." Charlotte turned to look at her mother. Margaret Whitmore had her hands folded in front of her, and her chin lifted slightly, which was her way of managing emotion that she found inconvenient. Her eyes, however, were bright. "Mama," Charlotte said. "Do not make me cry before the ceremony," Margaret said briskly. "I have already cried twice this morning, and it is not yet 9 o'clock." Charlotte crossed the room and took her mother's hands. Margaret looked at her. "I know I am not the daughter you expected," Charlotte said quietly. "No," Margaret agreed. "You are considerably more than I expected." She squeezed Charlotte's hands. "And I did not always handle that well. I want you to know I am aware of that." Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest. Something she had carried so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "You handled it the best you knew how," Charlotte said. "That is generous of you." "It is accurate," Charlotte said. "There is a difference." Margaret made a sound that was either a laugh or the beginning of the third round of crying. She pulled Charlotte into a brief, fierce embrace and then stepped back and straightened her own dress and said, "Well, are we ready?" "We are ready," Charlotte said. They were ready. The ceremony was small. The church held 60 people, and all 60 were there because they actually knew Charlotte and Harrington and wanted to be present, not because the event was the social performance of the season. Charlotte walked in with her father, and when she reached the front and looked at Harrington standing there, still composed, wearing the expression of a man who had decided something irrevocably and was entirely at peace with it, she felt nothing she had not already known. No surprises, No revelations. Just the clean, solid feeling of arriving somewhere she had been building toward for a very long time. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony. His wife in the third row was already crying. Charlotte noticed this with a small private warmth. They exchanged vows. She looked at William when she said them, and he looked at her, and the words were the ordinary words, but the weight behind them was not ordinary at all. It was the weight of everything they had built together in the months before this moment. The kitchen table strategy sessions, the 4-hour working mornings, the arguments they had both won at different times, the letters signed under both their names, the way he had never once asked her to stand behind him when standing beside him was available. When it was done, Eliza cried. Edmund did not cry, but he put his hand on Charlotte's shoulder for a long moment before he released her, and that was Edmund's equivalent. They were married. The Grand Washington Ball was not Charlotte's idea. It was in fact the idea of Senator Marcus Webb, a reform ally of Harrington's in Washington, who had been watching the Virginia political situation with considerable interest since the grave statement and its aftermath. Webb had organized the spring event annually for 12 years, a gathering of the political and business class of the eastern states, the kind of event where careers were made visible and relationships formalized. He had written to Harrington in February, requesting their attendance before the wedding, and Harrington had accepted in principle and told Charlotte about it afterward. Charlotte had said, "When in April, the 23rd. That gives us 5 weeks after the wedding." "Yes." She had looked at him steadily. "You know what this will be." "I know." "It will not be a celebration. It will be an introduction, a presentation. Washington will be deciding what to make of your wife, and whether she is an asset or a liability to your candidacy." "Yes," he said again. "And you accepted without asking me." A pause. "I told you about it immediately after. That is not the same as asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are right. I should have asked." Charlotte looked at him. "I will go," she said. "But I want you to understand that I know exactly what we are walking into." "I would not expect otherwise," he said. She had nodded, and then gone back to her letter, because there was work to be done before April, regardless of what April held. The 5 weeks between the wedding and the ball were the happiest of Charlotte's adult life. She would not have been able to say that while they were happening because she was too busy to measure happiness in the moment. But looking back, she would know it clearly. The weeks had a texture to them, a warmth and a steadiness, and a productive, purposeful energy that she had never felt before in the same combination. She and Harrington worked well together in person, which she had known from the study sessions. But living in the same household. Harrington had moved into the Whitmore estate temporarily, while their Washington home was being prepared at Edmund's invitation and Charlotte's private relief, because she had not wanted to leave her father's house, immediately revealed layers of compatibility she had not anticipated. How was quiet in the mornings and did not require conversation before he had finished his first cup of coffee. Charlotte was the same way. They had discovered this independently, and then one morning acknowledged it with a brief exchange that had become a kind of shared joke. "I appreciate," he had said at 7 in the morning, both of them at the kitchen table with their respective work, "that you do not speak before 8 o'clock unless it is operationally necessary." "I appreciate," Charlotte had replied without looking up, "that you have the same policy." They had gone back to their work. Eliza, passing through the kitchen 10 minutes later, had looked at both of them and said, "This is the strangest love story I have ever witnessed, and also I think it is perfect," and left before either of them could respond. She was not wrong. The morning of April 23rd arrived, and Charlotte dressed for the Washington Ball with the same practical precision she brought to everything. She was not nervous about the event, in the way she had once been nervous about social occasions, the low apologetic nervousness of a woman hoping to be found acceptable. She was alert, which was different. The alertness of someone who knows the terrain is important and is paying appropriate attention. Harrington came to find her when the carriage was ready. He stopped in the doorway of her room, looked at her for a moment, and said, "You look like you are preparing for a campaign." "I am," she said. "So are you." "True." He offered his arm. "Shall we go meet Washington?" She took his arm. "Let's," she said. The Webb estate in Washington was the largest private house Charlotte had seen, and she registered its scale without being impressed by it, because she had learned long ago that the size of a building told you very little about the quality of the people inside it. What she noticed was the people. They arrived before most of the guests, which Harrington had arranged deliberately. It was easier to hold ground than to enter a room already in motion. Senator Webb greeted them at the door, a man in his 60s, with the particular warmth of someone who had seen enough political maneuvering to appreciate directness. "Mrs. Harrington," Webb said, taking her hand. "I have been looking forward to meeting you since February." "And I you," Charlotte said. "Your advocacy for the grain supply legislation has been consequential. I have some thoughts about the Western County implementation, if you have time this evening." Webb blinked. Then he laughed a real surprised laugh. "William," he said to Harrington, "I see exactly what you meant." "I generally mean what I say," Harrington replied. They went in. The first hour was navigation. Charlotte moved through introductions with the focused calm of a woman who had mapped the terrain in advance, which she had spending 2 evenings before the event, reviewing Webb's guest list with Harrington, and building a clear picture of who in the room was an ally who was neutral and potentially movable, and who was connected to the Graves faction, and therefore watching for vulnerability. She was not performing. That was the thing she noticed about herself, and it felt important. At every social event she had attended in the 7 years with Nathaniel, and there had been many because Nathaniel loved social events she had performed, calibrated, made sure her words and expressions and opinions were shaped to reflect well on him, to avoid making him uncomfortable, to be the version of herself that required the least defense. Tonight, she was simply Charlotte Harrington. She said what she thought. She disagreed where she disagreed politely and specifically. She listened to things she already knew without interrupting, and asked questions she did not know the answers to. And when men directed their remarks about her own work to Harrington, rather than to her, she waited for exactly 3 seconds, and then answered anyway, pleasantly and directly, until the habit adjusted. It adjusted faster than she expected. By the second hour, 3 separate conversations had formed around her, rather than around Harrington, which she suspected he found more amusing than anything else. She was in the middle of a discussion about the grain legislation with Webb and 2 congressmen when she felt the shift in the room. It was subtle. The particular atmospheric change that happens when someone enters a space who carries charged significance. She registered it before she identified the source, and she registered Harrington registering it at the same moment, because after 5 months of working beside each other in high-pressure situations, they had developed a wordless awareness of each other that operated slightly below conscious thought. She turned. Nathaniel Ashford was standing at the entrance of the ballroom with Caroline on his arm. Charlotte had not known he would be here. She had not found his name on the guest list, and she understood immediately that he must have been added late, possibly at Graves's direction, which meant his presence tonight was not social. It was deliberate. A final play from a faction that had run out of cleaner options. Put Nathaniel Ashford in the same room as Charlotte Harrington in front of Washington society. Let the history speak. Let the discomfort be visible. Create a narrative about a woman and her past that the political allies could use to question her husband's judgment one more time. Charlotte understood all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then she turned back to Senator Webb and said, "I was saying about the Western County implementation." Webb looked slightly startled that she had simply continued. Then his expression shifted into something like appreciation. "Yes," he said. "Go on." She went on. Across the room she was aware with that peripheral precision that was simply part of how she functioned of Nathaniel watching her, of Caroline watching her, of several other guests becoming aware of the dynamic and watching all 3 of them the way people watch when they sense a scene developing. No scene developed. Charlotte finished her point about the grain legislation. Webb asked a follow-up question. She answered it. One of the congressmen made a note on the small card he kept in his breast pocket. Then Harrington appeared at her shoulder. "Nathaniel Ashford just arrived," he said quietly for her ears only. "I know," she said. "It is orchestrated." "Yes. I intend to speak to him briefly, as one would speak to any acquaintance at a social event, and then continue as planned." A pause. "I was going to suggest the same thing." Harrington said. Good. She glanced at him. Together or separately? Together, he said, unambiguously. She nodded. They crossed the room together, not urgently, not dramatically, simply walking at the natural pace of two people who had decided where they were going and saw no reason to rush, and Nathaniel turned as they approached, and Charlotte watched his face in the moment before his social composure reassembled itself. He had not expected her to walk toward him. He had expected her to avoid him, or to be uncomfortable, or to wait for Harrington to steer her elsewhere. He had expected she realized the Charlotte from June, who had sat in a carriage holding a letter with 8 words, and looked as though the ground had gone from under her feet. He got the Charlotte from April, who walked across a Washington ballroom with her husband's arm under her hand, and the calm certainty of a woman who had not spent the last 10 months waiting for this moment, because she had been too busy building something real to wait for anything. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Mrs. Ashford." She nodded to Caroline with genuine warmth. "It is good to see you." Caroline's expression had a quality. Charlotte recognized the careful control of someone managing a situation they found deeply uncomfortable, but were determined to manage gracefully. Good, Charlotte thought. They had that in common. "Mrs. Harrington," Caroline said. Her voice was steady. "Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you." Nathaniel said, "Charlotte," and then stopped, as though the sentence he had prepared had dissolved the moment she looked at him. She looked at him. How was the same? That was always the thing about people you had known well. They did not look as changed as the distance you had traveled from them would suggest. Nathaniel Ashford was the same man who had written 8 words on a piece of paper and sent a 14-year-old boy to deliver them. Handsome, uncertain, wanting to be seen as better than his choices. "Nathaniel," she said, pleasantly, normally, the way you spoke to anyone you had once known and now simply did not know in the same way. "You look well," he said. The inadequacy of the sentence was visible on his face the moment he said it. "I am well," Charlotte said. "William, you know Mr. Ashford, I believe." "We have met," Harrington said. His voice was entirely civil. He extended his hand, and Nathaniel shook it, and the two men exchanged the particular brief eye contact of men who understand exactly where they stand. "Good evening," Harrington said. "Good evening," Nathaniel said, and that was all. Charlotte turned back to Caroline. "I am glad you came this evening. There are some people I would like to introduce you to if you are interested. Senator Webb has been working on community welfare legislation that I believe you would find worth knowing about." Caroline blinked. Yes, I would." "Good." Charlotte turned to Harrington. "I will find you before supper." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression, quiet, warm, certain. "I will be here," he said. She turned and walked with Caroline Ashford toward Senator Webb, leaving Nathaniel standing with Harrington, and she heard Nathaniel say behind her, in a voice that was barely loud enough to carry, "She is remarkable." And Harrington, with no particular inflection at all, said simply, "Yes, she is." Charlotte did not look back. She did not need to. Senator Webb received Caroline with the easy warmth he extended to everyone, and within 10 minutes, they were deep in a conversation about community welfare distribution that Caroline, who had Charlotte discovered, been quietly organizing food drives in her own county for 2 years, without much recognition, engaged with a genuine and informed energy. Charlotte facilitated it, and then stepped back. She found a quiet moment at the edge of the room, and stood there holding a glass she was not drinking from, and looked at the room around her. Washington society. Political allies and opposition. The people who had tried to use her to diminish her husband's work, and the people who had stood beside them both when it mattered. Nathaniel across the room talking with 2 men she did not recognize with the expression of a man who was present in body and somewhere else in mind. Harrington near the fireplace in conversation with 2 congressmen holding the room with the quiet authority of someone who had long since stopped performing confidence and simply possessed it. And Charlotte, who had come into this room as a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she had built and why it mattered, standing on her own 2 feet in the center of Washington's most important social evening, having just diffused a political maneuver by walking across a room with her head up. She thought about the carriage. June. The bells. 8 words. I was not abandoned at the altar. I was forgotten before I ever arrived. She had whispered that to herself in a voice made entirely of grief and wounded dignity, and she had believed it then as a kind of survival mechanism, a way to frame the humiliation as something other than pure loss. She believed it still, but it meant something different now, because she understood standing in that room in April that being forgotten before she arrived had given her something she could not have gotten any other way. It had given her the months in the field before sunrise, the kitchen table at 4 in the morning with the account ledgers, the Hendricks resolution and the Croft crisis and the letters signed under her own name and the essay in the National Intelligencer and every conversation and every choice and every moment of choosing to build rather than to grieve. Being forgotten had made her visible, not to anyone else first, to herself, and everything else had followed from that. Harrington appeared beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He stood beside her and looked at the room the way she was looking at it, and they were quiet together in the comfortable way they had developed two people who understood that silence between them was not absence but presence. Then he said quietly, "How are you?" She considered the question. "I am exactly where I want to be," she said. He looked at her. "So am I," he said. They stood there another moment. Then Senator Webb's voice rose above the room calling for supper to be served, and the evening moved forward, and Charlotte Harrington walked into it with her husband's arm under her hand, and nothing behind her that she needed to carry anymore. The supper at Webb's estate ran long the way. Political suppers always did not, because the food required it, but because the conversations did, and in Washington conversations were the actual meal. Charlotte sat 3 seats from Senator Webb and 2 from a congressman named Aldridge, who represented Western Virginia, and had, according to Harrington's briefing notes, been undecided on the grain supply legislation for the better part of 6 months. She had noted his placement at the table when they were seated. She had not arranged it. Webb's wife managed the seating, but she recognized it as useful and treated it accordingly. Aldridge was not an unfriendly man. He was cautious, which was different. The caution of someone who had been in enough rooms to know that being wrong in public was expensive, and who therefore moved slowly and asked a great many questions before he committed to anything. Charlotte respected that. It was in its way her own method. She did not approach the legislation directly. She spoke with the woman to her left for the first course and with Webb across the table for the second. And by the time the third course arrived and the natural rhythm of supper conversation had shifted again, she and Aldridge had fallen into a discussion about crop yield patterns in the western counties that began as small talk and became within 10 minutes something considerably more substantive. He knew his district. That was clear. He knew it in the way men knew things they had learned by being physically present, rather than by reading reports the particular texture of real knowledge. The problem, Aldridge said setting down his fork, is that any pricing reform at the supply chain level takes 2-3 seasons to filter through to actual farm income. And I have constituents who need relief now, not in 2 seasons. You are right, Charlotte said. He looked slightly surprised. Politicians' wives, in his experience, did not lead with agreement when they were about to make a counter-argument. They softened first. Charlotte had learned that softening was often just delay. The immediate relief and the structural reform are not the same problem, she continued. They require different tools and a different timeline, and trying to solve them with the same legislation is why the bill has been stalled. You need a 2-stage approach. Relief mechanisms with a 60-day implementation window tied to structural reform with an 18-month rollout. Aldridge looked at her steadily. And the funding mechanism for the immediate relief. Redirect the existing commodity stabilization allocation that has been sitting unspent in the Eastern District budget for 14 months, Charlotte said. It does not require new appropriations. It requires a reallocation authorization, which needs Webb's committee, not a full-floor vote. Silence. Aldridge picked up his fork, set it down again. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "who told you about the unspent Eastern allocation?" "No one," Charlotte said. "I read the published budget reports." He stared at her. "All of them," he said. "It is useful to read the actual documents," Charlotte said pleasantly. "Most people summarize them instead. The summaries tend to omit the interesting parts." Aldridge looked down at his plate, looked back up. The expression on his face was the particular expression of a cautious man who had just found solid ground where he had expected to keep walking on ice. "I would like," he said carefully, "to continue this conversation after supper." "Of course," Charlotte said, and returned to her food. 3 seats down, she was aware of Harrington watching this exchange with the stillness of a man exercising significant restraint over his expression. When she glanced at him, he looked down at his own plate, but not before she caught the very slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth. She looked away and did not smile, but it was close. The after-supper conversation with Aldridge lasted 40 minutes and ended with his commitment to meet with Harrington's office the following week about the 2-stage approach. It was not a guaranteed vote. Charlotte had not expected one. A cautious man did not give guaranteed votes at dinner parties. But a commitment to meet was a door open, and Charlotte had spent enough time building things from available materials to know that a door open was everything. Webb found her as the evening was drawing close. "I owe William an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "I told him when he first mentioned you that he should be careful about mixing personal and political." Webb shook his head. "I was wrong about that." "You were being prudent," Charlotte said. "I was being conventional," he corrected. "There is a difference." He paused. "What you did with Aldridge tonight, I have been trying to move him for 4 months. 4 months of careful conversation and political maneuvering, and he still would not commit to a meeting. He needed someone to read the actual budget reports and show him the specific numbers," Charlotte said. "It was not complicated. It was," Webb said, "completely outside the way we usually do things here." Charlotte looked at him. "Maybe that is the problem with the way you usually do things here." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. Genuinely, the way he had laughed at the door when she had started talking about legislation before they were fully inside. "Yes," he said. "Maybe it is." He raised his glass to her briefly. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. The kind that meant something because it was understated. Charlotte inclined her head. The carriage home was quiet in the comfortable way their silences had become. Harrington sat across from her and looked out the window at the Washington night for a few minutes before he spoke. "Aldridge," he said. "He will come to the meeting," Charlotte said. "I cannot promise the vote." "I know." He paused. "Webb spoke to you." "He did." "What did he say?" "That he owed you an apology for telling you to keep me separate from the work." Harrington was quiet for a moment. "And what did you say?" "That he had been conventional rather than prudent." She paused. "And that perhaps that was the problem with the way things are done here." A silence. "You said that to Marcus Webb," Harrington said. "Was I wrong?" He looked at her. "No." "Then it was worth saying." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I have been thinking about what happens next." Charlotte understood that he did not mean tomorrow. He meant the longer arc, the candidacy, the assembly, the work that lay beyond the work they had already done. The future that had been abstract for months and was now becoming specific. "Tell me," she said. "If I win the seat," he said carefully, "the work changes. It becomes more visible, more contested. The people who opposed us over the past months, they will not disappear. They will regroup." "Yes," Charlotte said. "I know. And your role in all of it, your name, your work, it will draw scrutiny, more than it has already." "William," she said. He stopped. "Are you asking me if I am prepared for that?" she said. "Or are you preparing yourself to tell me something you think I will not like?" A pause. "Both," he said honestly. "Tell me the second part," she said. He met her eyes. "Webb has suggested that when I take the assembly seat, assuming I win, that your role should be formalized. Not just as my wife. As a documented advisor and policy contributor, named on record with defined responsibilities." He paused. "It would be unprecedented for a woman in that position." The carriage moved through the dark. Charlotte looked at him. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want what is right," he said. "I have always wanted what is right, but I am asking what you want because it is your name and your life, and I will not make that decision without you." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about June, about the letter, about the 7 years she had spent making herself small, and the 6 months she had spent rebuilding herself into something that required no apology. She thought about the Hendricks kitchen and the Croft resolution, and the letters signed under her own name, and Aldridge's face tonight, when she quoted the Eastern District budget allocation back at him from memory. She thought about the 14-year-old boy with the shaking hands. She thought about 8 words on a folded piece of paper. She thought about who she was now and who she had been then, and the distance between those two women, which was not the distance of time, but of choice, and what it would mean to be officially invisible again after everything she had done to make herself seen. "Yes," she said. Harrington looked at her. "Yes to the formalization. Yes to all of it," Charlotte said. "The seat, the formalization, the scrutiny. Yes." She held his gaze. "I have been careful and quiet and strategic for 6 months, because I needed to establish the ground before I claimed it. The ground is established." She paused. "I am done being careful about whether people are ready to see me." The silence that followed was the kind that has warmth in it. "Charlotte," he said. "William. I married the right person." "Yes," she said simply. "You did." The twist arrived 6 days later in the form of a letter that should not have existed. It came from a man named Porter, a records clerk in the Richmond municipal office, who had written in careful bureaucratic language to inform William Harrington that a formal inquiry had been lodged questioning the legal basis of several land contract renegotiations conducted in the county over the past 18 months. The inquiry named the Hendricks resolution specifically. It alleged that the restructuring had been conducted without proper authorization, and that the contracts might be legally invalid. If the contracts were invalidated, the Hendricks family and 7 other farming families would lose the legal protections that had kept their land secure since December. Charlotte read the letter at 6 in the morning. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she went to find Edmund. Her father was in the garden. She handed him the letter without preamble and watched his face as he read it. His expression moved through several stages: careful reading comprehension, and then a particular stillness that she recognized as controlled fury. "This is Graves," Edmund said. "Yes." "He could not win the political fight, so he is attacking the legal foundation of the community work." "Yes." "If these contracts are invalidated—" "I know, Papa." Edmund looked at her. "Can they be invalidated?" Charlotte was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "No," she said. "Every contract was properly executed under Virginia land law. I was meticulous. I was meticulous specifically because I knew something like this was possible." She paused. "But an inquiry, even an unfounded one, creates disruption. It frightens people. And frightened people sometimes make decisions that damage their own interests." Edmund looked at the letter. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to get to the Henderson farm before anyone else does," Charlotte said. "Before the inquiry letter reaches them, and before anyone has the opportunity to tell them what to think about it." She was in the carriage within the hour. James Henderson opened his door and looked at her face and said, "Something's wrong." "There is a challenge to the contracts," Charlotte said. "I want to explain it to you directly before you hear it from anyone else." He opened the door wider. "Come in." She sat at the same kitchen table where she had explained the Croft resolution in December. Mrs. Henderson brought coffee. Their 3 sons, now aware that something significant was happening, drifted into the room and sat without being asked. Charlotte explained it plainly. The inquiry. Who was behind it and why? The legal basis of the challenge and why it would not succeed. The timeline for resolution. And what the Hendersons needed to do in the meantime, which was nothing, not panic, not make decisions, not listen to anyone who came to them with alarm without first speaking to her. James Henderson listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You drove out here this morning to tell us before we had to be afraid." "Yes," Charlotte said. He looked at his wife. She looked at him. Something passed between them, the particular communication of two people who had been married long enough to speak without words. He turned back to Charlotte. "We trust you," he said. It was simple and direct and completely without qualification. Charlotte felt the words land in her chest in a way that would have made her throat tighten 6 months ago. Now they settled there like something recognized. "I will not let them take your land," she said. And she meant it not as a promise made in emotion, but as a statement of technical fact. She had the contracts. She had the documentation. She had already been thinking on the carriage ride over about which 3 legal points would be most efficiently decisive. "We know," Mrs. Henderson said. Charlotte drove to 5 other farms that morning. She had the same conversation 5 times. She was direct, specific, and calm at every kitchen table, and she watched the alarm in people's faces settle into steadiness as she laid out the facts. She did not minimize the challenge. She did not pretend it was nothing. She told them what it was not, and what would happen next. By the time she drove home in the early afternoon, her hands were tired from holding the reins, and her voice was slightly worn, and she felt underneath the fatigue the clean and particular satisfaction of a job done correctly before the damage could set in. Harrington was at the house when she returned. He had received his own copy of the Porter letter mid-morning, and had been, as she learned from Eliza, somewhat urgently trying to find Charlotte, who had not told anyone where she was going. I was standing in the front hall when she came in. "You went to the farms," he said. "Yes." "All of them. All of the ones directly named in the inquiry." He looked at her for a moment. "You went alone." "I did not need assistance for these conversations," Charlotte said. "I needed to be there before anyone else was. Speed was more important than company." He was quiet for a moment. "Are they steady?" he asked. "They are," she said. "They trust the contracts. They trust the legal basis. They will not be moved by the inquiry." "Because you went this morning." "Because the facts support their position," Charlotte said. "I simply made sure they had the facts before someone else had the opportunity to replace them with fear." Harrington looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued since November, the one that had never fully resolved itself into anything simple, because it was not simple. Respect and warmth, and something that sat underneath both of those, more personal and more permanent. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Your Washington legal contact," she said. "I want the response to the inquiry filed within 72 hours. I have the documentation. I need someone who knows the federal review process to file it in the right format. You will have the name within the hour." "Good." She started toward the study. "Charlotte." She turned. "You are extraordinary," he said. Not effusively, not dramatically. The way he said most things directly, because he meant exactly that, and nothing more elaborate was required. She looked at him. "I know," she said, and walked into the study to write the legal brief. The inquiry was formally dismissed 11 days later, on the grounds that all contracts had been properly executed under applicable Virginia statute, and that the challenge contained no substantive legal basis. The dismissal was documented in the Richmond Municipal Record. Charlotte read the dismissal notice at the kitchen table. She set it down. She picked up her coffee. Edmund across the table said, "Well." "Well," Charlotte agreed. "Graves has no more moves," Edmund said. "He may find new ones," Charlotte said. "Men like that generally do. But they take time to regroup, and in that time the work continues." She paused. "The grain legislation vote is in 3 weeks. The assembly campaign begins in earnest in May. There is significant work between now and then." Edmund looked at her. "You are not going to celebrate." Charlotte considered this. "I celebrated when the Henderson family kept their land in December," she said. "This is just the legal confirmation of what was already true." Edmund shook his head slowly. "You know," he said, "most people celebrate the victories." "I celebrate when the people I am working for are safe," Charlotte said. "The legal documentation is for the record. The safety is the actual victory." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother was like this." Charlotte looked at him surprised. He rarely spoke about his mother. She managed this estate alone for 6 years after my father died, Edmund said. Before I was old enough to take it on. Nobody talked about it much. Nobody acknowledged what she had done. He paused. She never asked them to. Charlotte was very still. She built something that lasted, Edmund said. And she did it without being thanked for it, and she did not appear to require the thanks. He looked at his daughter. You are more like her than you know. Charlotte looked at her coffee. Was she happy? She asked, quietly. I believe so, Edmund said. In the way people are happy when they are doing what they are made for. Charlotte nodded. She thought she understood that now in a way she could not have articulated in June. The happiness that was not loud. Not the happiness of relief or rescue, or someone finally choosing you. The happiness that came from being entirely and accurately yourself in the work you were made for, beside people who saw you clearly. It was not exciting. It was better than exciting. It was true. William Harrington won the Virginia Assembly seat in May, by a margin that surprised most of Washington and no one in the Whitmore kitchen. Charlotte heard the result in the late evening delivered by a rider from the county seat, with the kind of breathless energy that only existed in people carrying good news they were proud to carry. She was at her desk when it arrived. She read the result. She set the paper down. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the study in the lamplight, with the spring night coming through the window and the distant sound of the household stirring with the news. Then Harrington was in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. Congratulations, she said. He crossed the room, pulled up the chair across her desk. The chair that had been his chair since December, the one that bore the invisible imprint of every strategy session and crisis and conversation they had built this life through, and sat down. Ours, he said. She looked at him. Congratulations to us, he said. It was our work. Charlotte held his gaze. She thought about June, about the letter and the bells and the 8 words and the girl in the wedding gown who had been forgotten before she arrived. She thought about every morning between then and now, the pre-dawn field, the kitchen ledgers, the Hendricks table, the Washington supper, the legal brief, all of it. The long and specific and unglamorous work of becoming exactly who she was. She thought about the moment she had burned that piece of paper with her fears written on it, not because the fears were gone, but because she had decided they were not sufficient reason to stop. She thought about William Harrington saying, I need a partner, not an ornament, and meaning it precisely, and proving it daily, in every choice and every letter and every moment. He had called her work what it was hers. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not performed for, not admired from a comfortable distance, not reduced to usefulness or to ornament. Seen. Fully, specifically, accurately seen. She knew now what it felt like. She had built a life out of the ruins of a morning in June, and the life she had built was better, truer, deeper, more genuinely hers than anything she had been waiting for in the 7 years before it. Ours, she said, and meant it with her whole heart. Eliza burst into the study, 3 seconds later, with a sound that was somewhere between a shout and a laugh, and the news that Edmund had opened the good brandy, and Mrs. Henderson had sent a cake by the same rider who brought the result, and everyone was in the kitchen, and would they please come out of the study and celebrate like actual human beings for once in their lives. Charlotte looked at Harrington. He looked at her. She has a point, he said. She usually does, Charlotte said, and stood up. They walked out of the study together into the lit kitchen, and the noise and the brandy and the cake, and Charlotte sat at the table that had been the center of everything, every crisis and solution and strategy and late-night calculation, and let herself be simply present in a moment that was not a problem to be solved or a challenge to be met, but only a thing to be felt. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had not known she was building toward on the June morning when she folded a letter with 8 words and decided quietly and without ceremony that she would not be defined by the man who had failed to see her. She had been right. She was seen now by the Henderson family and the farming community and the National Intelligencer readers and Senator Webb and Congressman Aldridge and the 14 women who signed Mrs. Calloway's letter and the county that had watched her work in silence for 6 months and come to understand what that silence had contained. She was seen by the man sitting beside her with his hand on the kitchen table, close enough to hers that their knuckles touched, who had known her value before she walked into a room and had never once in all the months since asked her to be less than she was. And she was seen by herself, clearly, accurately, without apology or diminishment. That was the thing she had built in the end from the ruins of a June morning. Not a position, not a victory, not even a love story, though it was that too. She had built herself, and that was the only foundation worth standing on. The woman who had been forgotten before she ever arrived had become the woman that history would remember, not because someone had finally chosen her, but because she had, with courage and precision and relentless quiet work, chosen herself first.